The old radiator in apartment 4B gave a final metallic cough and died, leaving the small room in North Philadelphia silent, except for the whistling winter wind. Ma Louise sat at the small Formica kitchen table, her breath visible in the dim yellow light. She was wrapped in 3 layers of mismatched quilts, her fingers trembling not just from age, but from the biting chill that seeped through the cracked window panes like an unwanted guest. She pushed a small pile of quarters back and forth across the table, counting them for the 3rd time, but the math never changed. It wasn't enough for the heating bill. Elijah watched her from his corner on the floor. At 10 years old, he was small for his age, his frame lost inside a hand-me-down sweater that hung to his knees. He wasn't playing with toy cars or video games like the other boys in the building. He was hunched over a heavy leather-bound book borrowed from the public library titled The Unsolvable Paradoxes. To anyone else, the pages looked like a foreign language of Greek symbols and complex squiggles, but to Elijah, they were a map. He whispered the numbers softly like a prayer, finding a rhythm in the logic that the chaotic, freezing world outside couldn't offer. He adjusted his glasses, held together at the bridge by a strip of white tape, and looked at the flyer sitting on the counter. It was crumpled and stained with a ring of coffee, but the bold black letters stood out clearly: Philadelphia Young Mathematicians Competition. Grand prize, $5,000. He looked back at his grandmother, who was now rubbing her aching knees, trying to massage away the deep ache of arthritis that always flared up when the temperature dropped. She caught his eye and offered a weak, brave smile, the kind that tried to hide 1,000 worries. "Just a chilly night, baby," she whispered, her voice rasping. "The Lord is just testing our patience." Elijah knew it wasn't a test of patience. It was a test of survival. The abstract equations dancing in his head suddenly aligned with a very practical reality. The solution wasn't in the sparse pile of quarters on the table. It was in that competition. He picked up his pencil stub, the wood chewed down almost to the graphite, and pressed it firmly onto the flyer, circling the date. He didn't care about the trophy or the glory. He just wanted the shivering to stop. He packed his battered notebook into his superhero backpack, whispering into the darkness, "I'm going to get us that fire, Ma." The registration hall at the University of Pennsylvania smelled of floor wax, expensive perfume, and old money, a specific, sharp scent that made Elijah's cousin, Dante, clench his fists deep inside the pockets of his faded hoodie. Above them, crystal chandeliers glittered like frozen waterfalls, casting a prism of light that seemed to judge everyone who walked beneath it. To Dante, this building didn't feel like a school. It felt like a fortress built to keep people like them out. He stepped closer to Elijah, using his broad shoulders to create a shield against the sea of prep school blazers and confident parents discussing winter vacations in Aspen. "We don't belong here, Eli," Dante whispered, his voice tight with a mix of protective anger and unease. "Look at them. They're looking at us like we're here to fix the plumbing or deliver lunch." Elijah didn't look up. He gripped the straps of his superhero backpack until his knuckles turned ashy white. "I belong where the math is, Dante," he said softly, his voice unwavering despite his size. He looked almost comical in the oversized gray hoodie that swallowed his small frame, the sleeves rolled up 3 times just to free his hands. Around them, the whispers started. Not loud, but clear enough. "Is that child lost? Someone call security. Why is he wearing that?" The air felt heavy, suffocating, charged with a silent, polite hostility that was colder than the wind outside. They reached the front of the line. The volunteer at the desk hesitated, looking past Elijah to Dante. But before she could speak, a shadow fell over the table. Professor Julian Thorne stepped in. He was a tall man in an impeccably tailored charcoal suit, wearing a gold watch that cost more than Elijah's entire apartment building. He didn't look at Dante. He looked down at Elijah, his eyes narrowing with amusement rather than curiosity. "And what do we have here?" Thorne's voice was smooth, projected perfectly for the reporters hovering nearby. He plucked the registration form from Elijah's hand. "Name, Elijah Barnes. Project topic." Thorne paused. His eyebrows shot up theatrically. He looked at the paper, then at the boy, then back at the paper. A smile curled on his lips, cruel and sharp. "The Thornvance paradox? You intend to solve my paradox?" Elijah nodded. "Yes, sir. I've been working on it." Thorn didn't get angry. He laughed. It started as a chuckle and grew into a booming, resonant sound that stopped all conversation in the lobby. He turned to the crowd of wealthy parents and students, holding up Elijah's crumpled form like a prop. Did everyone hear this? This is delightful. Our little mascot here thinks he can solve the unsolvable with a library card and a pencil stub. It's the best Christmas joke I've heard all year. The laughter that followed wasn't warm. It was sharp and jagged. It rippled through the hall, a wave of ridicule crashing down on a 10-year-old boy. Dante stepped forward, ready to snap, but Elijah put a small hand on his cousin's arm to stop him. Elijah stood perfectly still in the eye of the storm, his face unreadable behind his taped-up glasses. Thorn wiped a tear of mirth from his eye, pulled a red stamp from his pocket, and slammed it down on the paper with a heavy thud. Approved. He handed it back, leaning down until his face was inches from Elijah's, his cologne overpowering. "Don't cry when the numbers eat you alive, boy," he whispered. "Fear tastes like old copper pennies, metallic and sharp on the back of the tongue," and Elijah had a mouthful of that bitter taste as he walked onto the stage for the preliminary round. The lecture hall was cavernous, a coliseum of higher learning designed to make anyone standing at the bottom feel insignificant. Rows of stadium seating stretched up toward the ceiling, filled with whispering spectators, skeptical judges, and competitors who looked more like young corporate executives than students. The chalkboard behind the podium was a massive slate monolith, black and imposing, stretching 12 feet across and mounted high on the wall, clearly designed for full-grown adults, not for a 10-year-old boy wearing sneakers that had been glued back together twice. The proctor's voice boomed over the microphone, announcing the start of the calculus speed round. "You have 5 minutes. Begin." Beside Elijah, the teenage competitors sprang into action. Chalk hit the boards in a flurry of white dust. They were tall, confident, their arms reaching high, writing out complex derivatives with practiced ease. Elijah stepped forward, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He reached up, standing on his tiptoes, stretching his small arm until his shoulder ached, but the tip of his chalk barely grazed the bottom molding of the board. He couldn't even reach the writing surface. He stood there, frozen, a tiny figure drowning in a sea of academia. A ripple of laughter started in the back row and rolled forward like a tide. "Does he need a ladder?" someone shouted, their voice dripping with amusement. "Maybe he needs a high chair," another voice called out. From the judges' table, Professor Thorn watched with a satisfied smirk, leaning back in his leather seat as if watching a comedy routine he had personally orchestrated. He didn't intervene. He let the humiliation linger, letting the boy feel every second of his inadequacy. Elijah looked at the board, then at the laughing crowd, and finally at the heavy solid oak chair sitting behind the professor's lectern. He didn't ask for help. He didn't cry. He simply walked over to the chair. It was heavy, built for a large man, but Elijah grabbed the legs and began to drag it. Screech. The sound of wood scraping against the polished stage floor was loud, jarring, and ugly. It cut through the laughter like a knife, silencing the room instantly. He dragged it 5 feet, then 10. The only sound in the massive hall was the boy's heavy breathing and the agonizing scrape of the chair. He positioned it directly in front of his section of the board. With a deep breath, he climbed up. First one knee, then a foot, pulling himself up until he was standing on the seat. Suddenly, he was tall enough. He didn't look at the audience. He looked at the problem. The numbers welcomed him back. His hand moved in a blur. Tap, tap, scratch. While the high schoolers were still writing out the third line of their equations, Elijah was already simplifying the function. He wasn't just solving. He was condensing, seeing shortcuts that the textbooks didn't teach. Dust flew from his chalk, coating his dark fingers in white powder. "Done," he said softly, putting the chalk down. Professor Thorn blinked, his smirk vanishing. He checked his watch. Barely 2 minutes had passed. He stood up, towering over the seated judges. "That is impossible," Thorn declared, his voice booming. "You skipped 4 essential steps. Your methodology is unconventional and reckless." Elijah turned around, still standing on the chair, looking down at the professor for the first time. "It's not standard, sir," Elijah said, his voice steady, projecting to the back of the silent room. "But it's faster." And it's correct. Dr. Sarah Jenkins, the younger judge sitting beside Thorne, stood up and walked to the board. She traced the logic, her eyes widening behind her spectacles. She checked the derivation, looked for a flaw, and found none. She looked up at the boy on the chair, a child in oversized clothes who had just outpaced the state's best students. "He's right, Julian," she said, her voice amplified by the microphone. "It's elegant. Truly elegant." As Elijah climbed down from his perch, his knees slightly shaking now that the adrenaline was fading, a student in the front row quietly hit upload on his phone. The video file was titled "The Chair Kid vs. the Professor." Deep in the pocket of Thorne's expensive suit, his phone buzzed, a single, short vibration that signaled the first drop of rain before the storm. Snow wasn't the only thing piling up in Philadelphia that week. Views on the Chair Kid video had just crossed the 1 million mark, and Professor Thorne's office phone wouldn't stop ringing. In the dim, oak-paneled sanctuary of his office at the university, Thorne poured himself another glass of expensive scotch, his hand trembling slightly not from cold, but from a rage that burned hot in his chest. On his computer screen, the video played on a loop, the scraping of the wooden chair, the cloud of chalk dust, and the boy's calm voice correcting him. But it was the comments scrolling beneath the video that cut him deepest. "The professor looks like he swallowed a lemon," one user wrote. "Finally, someone humbled the giant," wrote another. The joke he had started in the lobby had mutated, turning back to bite him with vicious irony. He wasn't the ringmaster anymore. He was the punchline. The phone buzzed again. It was the dean of the university. Thorne answered, his voice tight. "Julian," the dean's voice was clipped and cold, "donors are calling. They're asking why a 10-year-old from North Philly is outsmarting our tenure-track faculty. The world is watching this final round. Don't let this turn into a circus." The line went dead. Thorne stared at the receiver. A circus. That's what they thought of his life's work. He looked at the framed awards on his wall, the accolades of 30 years, all threatened by a child in a hoodie. He wouldn't let it happen. He couldn't. Miles away, in a kitchen that smelled of corn chowder and old pipes, the atmosphere was different. Ma Louise stood over the stove, stirring the pot with a wooden spoon, wrapped in her thickest shawl because the radiator was still nothing more than a cold metal decoration. Elijah sat at the table, his head resting on his arms. Dante was scrolling through an old, cracked tablet, his face illuminated by the blue glow of the screen. "Listen to this one, Lai," Dante said, a grin breaking across his face. "My grandpa says he hasn't seen math like that since the moon landing. Go get them, Chair Kid. You're famous, little man. People from all over the city are rooting for you. They're calling you the boy on the chair." Elijah didn't smile. He looked small, smaller than he had on stage. "It's just a video, Dante," he whispered, tracing a groove in the table. "Professor Thorne, he hates me. I saw his eyes. He's going to make sure I lose tomorrow. What if I get up there and I don't know the answer? What if I'm just a joke after all?" Dante put the tablet down. The playfulness vanished from his face. He reached out and tapped the broken radiator with his knuckle clank, clank. "Look at me, Eli." He waited until his cousin looked up. "You think you're doing this for those people on the internet? You think you're doing this for a trophy?" Dante pointed to the shivering shoulders of Ma Louise at the stove. "You're doing it for us. You're doing it so Ma doesn't have to sleep in a coat. That's real. That's scary. But that's why you're going to win. Not because you're smart, but because you have to." Back in the university office, the scotch glass was empty. Thorne made his decision. He logged into the competition's secure server. His fingers hovered over the file named standard_final_problem_set.pdf. With a click, he deleted it. In its place, he uploaded a file that had sat dormant on his hard drive for decades, the underserver.pdf. It was the problem that had ruined his friendship with Dr. Vance. It was the problem that had no solution. "Let's see you climb out of this one, kid," Thorne whispered to the empty room, a cruel smile returning to his face. The morning of the finals arrived with a blizzard. Whiteout conditions outside matched the blank, cruel stare on Thorne's face as he waited for his victim. The silence in the grand auditorium was heavy and physical, the kind of suffocating quiet that usually descends right before a judge reads a life sentence. Under the blinding glare of the television lights, The Christmas wreaths hung on the walls looked limp and ironic, festive decorations for an execution. On the gigantic screen behind the stage, the pixels rearranged themselves to reveal the final problem. It wasn't a standard calculus equation. It was a sprawling, chaotic beast of logic and symbols titled the Thorn-Vance Paradox. A gasp went through the room, not from the audience, but from the stage. The teenage finalists, the best and brightest from the state's most expensive private schools, stared at the screen in horror. One girl, a prodigy from a prep school in the suburbs, simply dropped her pencil. It hit the floor with a hollow clatter. She buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking. Another boy stared blankly, his mouth slightly open, realizing that every tutor and textbook money could buy hadn't prepared him for a question that had no answer. Professor Thorne leaned into his microphone. The sound of his breath amplified through the speakers was like the hiss of a steam valve. He didn't look at the teenagers. His eyes were locked on the smallest figure at the end of the row. Well, Thorne's voice was smooth, dripping with faux concern. Still think it's a joke, boy? Or are you ready to go back to your coloring books and leave the mathematics to the adults? Elijah froze. The blood drained from his face, leaving him dizzy. The numbers on the screen swam before his eyes. For a terrifying heartbeat, he believed Thorne. He's right, a voice whispered in Elijah's head. I'm just a kid in a hoodie. I'm just a charity case. He looked out into the darkness of the audience, searching desperately. In the front row, he saw her. Ma Louise. She wasn't looking at the screen. She was looking at him, clutching her cane with both hands, her eyes fierce and unblinking. She nodded a single, sharp motion. You are a giant, she had said. Elijah took a breath. He looked back at the screen. The fear receded, replaced by a strange sense of familiarity. He blinked. He knew this monster. He had wrestled with this monster on the floor of his freezing apartment for 2 years. He had traced its edges in the library book with the broken spine, and he remembered why Thorne and Vance had never solved it. They were looking for a perfect, infinite system. But Elijah knew something about the world that rich professors didn't. Nothing is infinite. Everything has a limit. Everything runs out: heat, food, money. He didn't raise his hand. He didn't ask for permission. For the second time, Elijah walked over to the heavy oak chair. He dragged it to the center of the stage. Screech. The sound was louder this time. Not a sound of struggle, but a sound of declaration. It sounded like a judge's gavel striking the bench. Thorne started to stand up. Sit down, boy. You are making a fool of. Elijah climbed onto the chair. He picked up the chalk. He didn't hesitate. He slashed a line through the middle of Thorne's equation. The audience gasped. Then he began to write. He didn't try to solve the paradox. He dismantled it. He introduced a new symbol, a constraint variable representing real-world limits, the very thing the academic world had ignored for 30 years. Tap, tap, scratch. Tap, tap, scratch. The rhythm was hypnotic. Elijah wrote with a fury, his hand moving faster than thought. He was correcting a typo in the universe. He showed that the paradox wasn't a mystery. It was a mistake based on arrogance. As he reached the final line, his hand cramped, but he didn't stop. He wrote the final proof, a simple, elegant conclusion that tied the chaotic equation into a perfect knot. Snap. The chalk broke in his hand on the final period. Dust drifted down like snow onto his worn-out sneakers. Elijah stood there, chest heaving, high above the stage on his wooden pedestal. Dr. Sarah Jenkins was the first to move. She walked to the blackboard, her heels clicking on the hardwood. She adjusted her glasses, leaning in so close her nose almost touched the slate. She traced the logic, line by line, her lips moving silently. She looked for the flaw. She looked for the error. She found only truth. Her clipboard slipped from her numb fingers and clattered to the floor. She grabbed the microphone, her voice trembling with shock as she looked directly at a pale, shaking Professor Thorne. He's right, she whispered, the sound echoing like thunder. The paradox. It's solved. It wasn't the thunderous applause that Elijah would remember years later, nor was it the blinding flash of 100 cameras exploding at once like a lightning storm indoors. It was the look on Professor Thorne's face, pale, hollow, and haunting. It was the look of a man seeing a ghost, not of the dead, but of his own failures rising up to confront him. The arrogance that had armored him for decades had disintegrated, leaving behind only an old, frightened man slumped in a leather chair that suddenly looked too big for him. Pandemonium erupted in the auditorium. The silence shattered into a roar of disbelief and jubilation. Ma-Louise was sobbing, her head bowed in prayer, while Dante was screaming, "That's my blood. That's my brother," jumping up and down so hard the floorboards shook. Reporters swarmed the stage like sharks scenting blood, pushing microphones into the face of the 10-year-old boy who was still clutching a piece of chalk. "Elijah! Elijah! Look here!" shouted a reporter from Channel 6. "Professor Thorne tried to trick you. He gave you an unsolvable problem to humiliate you on live television. How does it feel to destroy his career? What do you have to say to him now?" The room quieted down, waiting for the anger. They expected a tantrum, a shout of victory, or a demand for justice. It was the perfect narrative for the evening news, the underdog biting back. Elijah held the heavy crystal trophy in one arm, the oversized check for $5,000 tucked under the other. He looked at the cameras, then he turned his back on them. He walked slowly across the stage toward the judges' table. Thorne didn't look up. He was staring at his hands, trembling on the polished wood. He flinched when he saw the shadow of the boy fall over him. "Sir." Elijah's voice was small, but clear. Thorne looked up. His eyes were red-rimmed. You solved it," he croaked, his voice stripped of all its polished cadence. 30 years. I couldn't see the limit. I thought it was infinite." "It's okay," Elijah said softly. He shifted the trophy and extended a small, chalk-dusted hand. "I forgive you, Professor." Thorne blinked, confused. "You forgive me? After what I did? I tried to break you." "You didn't know," Elijah said, shaking his head with a wisdom that seemed ancient. "You judged the book by its cover, just like the poster in the library says not to. You thought because I was small and poor and from the north side that I was empty inside. But you were wrong." Elijah stepped closer, his hands still outstretched. "But Grandma says staying mad is like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die. So I forgive you." A hush fell over the stage. The cameras zoomed in. Slowly, painfully, Professor Julian Thorne reached out. His hand, manicured and shaking, grasped the small, rough hand of the boy. It was 65 years of pride meeting 10 years of grace. In that handshake, the audience saw something rarer than mathematical genius. They saw mercy. Thorne bowed his head, a single tear tracking through the powder on his cheek. "Thank you," he whispered. "I'm sorry." An hour later, the lights of the university faded behind them. Elijah, Dante, and Ma-Louise walked out into the Philadelphia night. The blizzard had settled into a gentle, silent snowfall, coating the city in a clean white blanket. The trophy was heavy, but the check in Ma-Louise's pocket felt heavier, warm, and real. "We did it, Ma," Dante said, wrapping his arm around Elijah's shoulders. "We really did it." Ma-Louise stopped on the sidewalk. She ignored the pain in her knees. She bent down and cupped Elijah's face, her thumbs brushing away a smudge of chalk dust. "You didn't just win a contest, baby," she whispered, her voice thick with pride. "You showed them what a king looks like. A real king." Elijah looked up at the falling snow, sticking out his tongue to catch a flake. He didn't feel like a king. He just felt warm. "Ma." "Yes, baby. Can we stop for hot chocolate on the way home? The heater won't be fixed until tomorrow." Ma-Louise laughed, a sound that rang like a bell in the cold night air. "Baby, with this check, we can buy enough hot chocolate to fill a swimming pool. We're getting that heater and a new coat and maybe even a new chair for you to stand on." Elijah smiled, squeezing her hand tight as they walked into the darkness, leaving the fame behind them. "Merry Christmas, Ma." 2 weeks later, the radiator in apartment 4B finally hummed with a steady warmth, matching the new peace that had settled over the small home. On the kitchen table lay a handwritten letter from Professor Thorne, thanking the boy who had taught him that humility is the highest form of intelligence. Elijah watched the snow fall outside, no longer shivering, realizing that he hadn't just solved a paradox, he had solved the problem of being invisible. Ma-Louise was right all along. True genius isn't about how much you know, but how much you are willing to forgive. In the end, Kindness was the hidden variable that made the whole equation work.